Do you know why I stopped you tonight?
No, officer, I was driving carefully.
We had a report of suspicious activity. What are you doing out here this late?
Just coming back from dinner, sir, heading home.
The flashing red and blue lights didn't just pierce the foggy coastal night. They cut straight through the false sense of security Marcus had earned after 10 years of working alongside the very people who were now treating him like a threat. The heavy, humid air of the Pacific Northwest clung to the windshield of Marcus's 10-year-old Ford F-150 as the rhythmic, hypnotic swish of the windshield wipers kept time with his elevated pulse. Beside him sat his younger brother, David, who had flown in from Chicago just 3 hours earlier. David was a software developer, a man used to the predictable rhythms of city life and the comfort of brightly lit grid streets. He was already out of his element in this dark, heavily forested stretch of highway that hugged the perimeter of the sprawling naval installation. The two men had just left a late-night diner a few miles back, a muted, fluorescent-lit establishment where the clinking of heavy ceramic coffee mugs and the low, constant hum of a neon vacancy sign had provided the backdrop for a long overdue reunion. They had sat in a cracked vinyl booth, catching up, while Marcus used a ballpoint pen to sketch out the sheer scale of the naval base on a paper napkin, trying to explain the massive logistics of his job as a civilian defense contractor. It was an innocent conversation, two brothers bridging a gap of time and distance, but in a town where the military base was the center of the universe, outsiders asking questions and drawing maps in the dead of night tended to make locals nervous. Now, the stark, blinding glare of a police cruiser's LED light bar flooded the cabin of the truck, casting long, frantic shadows across the dashboard. Marcus eased his foot off the accelerator, the tires hissing against the wet asphalt as he guided the heavy vehicle onto the narrow gravel shoulder. The crunch of the loose stones beneath the tires sounded deafening in the sudden quiet of the cab. David's hands immediately fluttered toward his lap, his breathing hitching. He reached toward the glove box. Marcus shot out a hand, his grip firm and steady on his brother's forearm. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone was an iron rod. He told David to keep his hands visible, flat on his knees, and to let him do the talking. Marcus knew the rule. He knew the unspoken dynamics of living adjacent to a high-security military zone, where local law enforcement and federal security apparatuses constantly rubbed shoulders, creating an atmosphere of hypervigilance that easily bled into outright paranoia. In the cruiser behind them, Chief Thomas Miller of the local municipal police department sat in the soft blue glow of his mobile data terminal. Running the Ford's plates, Miller was a 20-year veteran of the force, a man whose entire career had been defined by the invisible boundary line between civilian jurisdiction and military authority. He wasn't a bad man, but he was a tired one, deeply reliant on a finely tuned gut instinct that, over the years, had become increasingly entangled with subtle, unexamined biases. 10 minutes earlier, Miller had received a dispatch call originating from the diner. The night manager, a woman who prided herself on her civic duty, had called the non-emergency line to report two men in a booth, acting suspiciously, whispering, and drawing diagrams of the base's Southgate access road. When Miller spotted the beat-up Ford making a slightly wide right turn out of the diner's parking lot, drifting perhaps an inch over the fog line, he had his pretext. It was a minor traffic infraction, a trivial misstep that would normally warrant a passing glance. But framed by the phone call, it became the justification for a stop. Miller stepped out of his cruiser, the heavy thud of his door closing echoing into the damp night. He adjusted the utility belt at his waist, the leather creaking slightly as he walked. The ambient noise of the night, the distant, low-frequency hum of a military transport plane idling somewhere on the tarmac miles away. The dripping of condensation from the towering pine trees was suddenly punctuated by the steady, deliberate crunch of Miller's boots on the gravel. He approached the passenger side of the truck, a tactical decision meant to keep him out of the traffic lane and to give him a better view of the vehicle's interior. As he neared the truck bed, He placed his left hand briefly on the cold metal of the taillight, leaving a fingerprint, a habitual procedural safety measure drilled into him at the academy. Inside the truck, Marcus rolled down his window, letting in a rush of cold, pine-scented air. He kept his hands draped loosely over the top of the steering wheel, his posture relaxed but highly alert. He could hear the officer's footsteps stopping just behind his peripheral vision. A brilliant white beam of a heavy-duty maglite suddenly pierced the cab, sweeping over the back seat, lingering on a duffel bag, before settling squarely on David's rigid face, then snapping over to Marcus. The light caught the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Miller's voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, authoritative, but betraying no immediate hostility. He asked for a license, registration, and proof of insurance. Skipping the usual pleasantries, Marcus complied slowly, narrating his movements in a calm, measured voice. He explained that his wallet was in his back right pocket and his registration was in the center console. As Marcus moved, Miller's eyes tracked every shift of fabric, every twitch of muscle. He watched David, who was sitting stiffly, staring straight ahead, swallowing hard. So Miller, David's acute nervousness wasn't the natural reaction of a citizen uncomfortable with police interactions. Framed by the diner manager's phone call, it was a glaring indicator of guilt. The subtle machinery of confirmation bias was already grinding away in Miller's mind. He had subconsciously decided that these two men did not belong here, that their presence on this specific road at this specific time was inherently dangerous. Marcus handed the requested documents out the window. Miller took them, shining his light on the laminated cards. He noted the address on Marcus's license, a town 3 hours away. He looked back at Marcus, his brow furrowing slightly in the shadows behind the flashlight. Miller asked what brought them out to this side of town so late. It was a standard conversational tactic, designed to elicit inconsistencies, but Marcus felt the immediate shift in the dynamic. The question wasn't driven by curiosity. It was an interrogation. Marcus answered plainly, stating they had just finished a late dinner and were heading to his rental property near the coast. He didn't volunteer the information about the military base. He knew that over-explaining often triggered more suspicion, a lesson learned from years of navigating spaces where his presence was frequently questioned. Mille Pause, the silence stretching out, filled only by the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers. He asked about the diagrams. He asked what they were sketching on napkins back at the diner. The question hit the cramped cabin like a physical blow. David let out a sharp, quiet breath. Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened just a fraction of an inch, his knuckles turning slightly white under the streetlights. The realization washed over him. They weren't being pulled over for drifting over a fog line. They were being pulled over because someone at the diner had watched them, judged them, and reported them. Marcus kept his voice perfectly level, stripping away any hint of defensiveness. He explained that he was simply showing his brother the layout of his workplace. Miller's flashlight beam didn't waver. He asked where Marcus worked. Marcus replied that he worked as a defense contractor for Naval Sea Systems Command. Miller scoffed quietly, a micro-expression of disbelief that spoke volumes. The idea that this man in a worn-out flannel shirt, driving a rusted truck, was involved in high-level defense logistics didn't align with Miller's preconceived notions of who held those clearances. The narrative in Miller's head was too firmly entrenched. He asked if there were any weapons in the vehicle. Marcus replied that there were none. Miller then asked, his tone shifting into something harder and more demanding, if Marcus would consent to a search of the vehicle. This was the invisible line in the sand, the precise moment where routine law enforcement procedure collided with constitutional rights. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures, demanding that officers have probable cause, a reasonable belief that a crime is being or will be committed to search a vehicle without a warrant. A vague phone call about a napkin drawing and a nervous passenger did not meet that threshold. It barely met the standard for reasonable, articulable suspicion to even prolong the traffic stop beyond writing a ticket for crossing the fog line. Marcus knew this. He had been thoroughly briefed on his rights and the legal boundaries of base adjacent security protocols during his clearance orientations. Marcus turned his head slightly, looking directly into the blinding glare of the flashlight. He politely, but firmly, declined the search. He stated that he did not consent to any searches of his vehicle or his person. The air in the cab instantly grew heavy. The refusal, while a fundamental constitutional right, is almost always interpreted by seasoned officers like Miller as an admission of concealed guilt, the atmosphere shifted from a tense inquiry to a standoff. Miller's radio crackled with static. A brief burst of dispatch chatter that went ignored. The officer took a half step back, his hand dropping to rest casually on the butt of his sidearm, not drawing it, but a clear, subconscious assertion of physical dominance and authority. Miller told Marcus that he was making things difficult. He stated that if they had nothing to hide, a search would clear things up quickly and they could be on their way. It was a classic coercive tactic, leveraging the inherent power imbalance of the roadside encounter. Marcus didn't take the bait. He calmly reiterated his refusal. He then asked, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of legal precision, if he was being written a citation for a traffic violation, or if he was free to go. In the eyes of the law, once the objective of a traffic stop is completed or should reasonably have been completed, the stop must end. Extending it to fish for evidence of an unrelated crime without independent reasonable suspicion is a direct violation of civil liberties. A standard clearly outlined in the Supreme Court case Rodriguez v. United States. Miller felt a surge of frustration. His authority was being challenged, not with aggression, but with a cold, impenetrable wall of legal literacy. Driven by his unyielding gut instinct and the adrenaline of the standoff, Miller made a critical procedural error. He ordered Marcus to turn off the engine and step out of the vehicle. David made a small, involuntary sound of panic in the passenger seat. Marcus slowly raised his hands, ensuring they were entirely visible in the ambient light. He turned the key, silencing the engine. The sudden absence of the motor's rumble made the rain sounding against the roof feel deafening. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt with a loud, metallic click. He opened the door and stepped out into the damp, cold air. He was a few inches taller than Miller, a physical reality that only heightened the officer's defensive posture. Miller instructed Marcus to turn around and place his hands on the roof of the truck. Marcus complied, his face pressing against the cold. Vite, Mattel. He felt the officer's hands patting down his sides, checking for weapons. It was a Terry frisk. Legally permissible only if the officer reasonably suspects the person is armed and dangerous. A napkin drawing and a refusal to consent to a search did not logically equate to being armed and dangerous. But the boundaries of the law were blurring rapidly on this dark shoulder of the road. As Miller's hands moved over Marcus's back pockets, he felt a thick leather wallet. He pulled it out, shining his light on it. He flipped it open. Inside, nestled securely behind a clear plastic window, was a solid white plastic card with a prominent microchip, a barcode, and a holographic seal. It was a Department of Defense Common Access card, the highest tier of civilian security clearance, granting the bearer unescorted access to the most sensitive areas of the very naval installation Miller was supposedly protecting them from. Below the seal was a photograph of Marcus, looking exactly as he did now. Alongside his contractor designation and clearance level, the silence that followed was absolute. The steady rhythm of the rain seemed to fade into the background. Miller stood there, the heavy flashlight in one hand, the DoD CAC in the other. He stared at the card, then up at the back of Marcus's head, and back down at the card, the solid, unyielding reality of the plastic rectangle violently shattered the narrative Miller had constructed. The men weren't casing the base, they belonged there, operating at a level of security clearance that Miller himself did not possess. The tension didn't evaporate, it merely mutated. It shifted from the sharp, immediate danger of a physical confrontation to the deep, uncomfortable realization of a massive professional and personal misjudgment. Miller stepped back. He told Marcus to turn around. He handed the wallet back, his movements suddenly rigid, entirely devoid of the casual authority he had wielded moments before. The flashlight beam was lowered to the asphalt, casting a pale pool of light around their boots. Miller didn't apologize. The culture of his profession rarely allowed for an immediate admission of fault on the shoulder of a dark highway. Instead, he cleared his throat. His gravelly voice now lacking its previous edge, he stated that the fog line was hard to see in this weather and issued a verbal warning to drive carefully. He told them they were free to go. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't demand an apology or threaten legal action right then and there. He simply slid his wallet back into his pocket, walked back to the driver's side door, and climbed in. He started the engine. The familiar rumble, a comforting anchor in the aftermath of the storm. He put the truck in drive and slowly pulled away, leaving Chief Miller standing in the rain, bathed in the red and blue glow of his own cruiser, staring after the taillights until they disappeared into the fog. The drive to the rental house was suffocatingly quiet. David sat curled in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing dark trees, his hands shaking slightly in his lap. Marcus kept his eyes locked on the road, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The encounter had ended without physical violence, without an arrest. But the violation was profound. The emotional toll of having to flawlessly navigate a high-stakes armed encounter, of having to suppress every human instinct of anger or fear just to survive a misunderstanding, was a heavy, invisible weight that settled squarely on Marcus's shoulders. He had proven his innocence, but the fact that he was forced to prove it at all, stripped of his dignity on the side of a wet road based entirely on someone else's unfounded assumption, left a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. But the incident did not vanish into the foggy night. Marcus was methodical, a man whose career was built on logistics and accountability. The following morning, he drove to the municipal police department and formally filed a complaint regarding the stop. He detailed the lack of probable cause, the unlawful extension of the traffic stop, and the unwarranted pat-down. He submitted the exact time and location, forcing the department to pull the dash cam and body cam footage from Chief Miller's cruiser. The subsequent internal investigation was not a swift, dramatic affair, but a slow, agonizing bureaucratic process. The footage was undeniable. It captured the entirety of the stop, from the agonizingly slow approach to the explicit demand for a search based on an unverified, paranoid phone call, to the illegal order to exit the vehicle without reasonable suspicion. The video didn't show a malicious, cartoonish villain. It showed a seasoned officer allowing his unexamined biases and reliance on flawed assumptions to completely override his legal training. It showed how easily the constitutional rights of a citizen could be dismantled on a dark road when authority goes unchecked by objective facts. The fallout was realistic and measured. Chief Miller wasn't fired outright, but he was placed on administrative leave pending a full review board. The local newspaper, a small publication usually dedicated to high school sports and base events, ran a front page story on the incident, sparking a tense, uncomfortable dialogue within the town. The community was forced to reckon with the invisible lines it drew between who was perceived as a protector and who was perceived as a threat. The diner manager faced severe public backlash for her weaponized use of the emergency dispatch system, highlighting the dangerous consequences of civilian profiling. Miller eventually faced disciplinary action and mandatory retraining on Fourth Amendment protocols. His impeccable 20-year reputation permanently stained by a single assumption-driven mistake. Months later, Marcus still drove that same stretch of highway, the rhythm of his life largely unchanged. But every time the sun dipped below the horizon and the fog rolled in off the coast, his eyes would instinctively dart to the rearview mirror, bracing for the sudden flash of red and blue. The physical danger had passed, but the psychological scar remained a constant, lingering reminder of how fragile freedom can be. It leaves us to wonder, in a society that grants immense power to those tasked with our protection, how do we ensure that their instincts are guided by the law rather than blinded by the very human flaw of prejudice? The true danger often lies not in the malicious intent of authority, but in the quiet, unquestioned assumptions we allow to masquerade as truth.